By sunrise, the lower cattle corrals at Arroyo Seco Ranch were a field of black wire and smoking posts. The hay shed was gone. 2 miles of fence had burned, and the only barn still holding animals stood on the piece of ground everyone in San Miguel County had spent years calling dead. 38 llamas were gathered beside a steel water tank on a shelf of basalt above the ranch. Their coats were gray with ash. The outer grass around them had burned in ragged strips, but the barn was standing. The sorting room was standing. The herd was alive. And the 64 acres that could never carry enough cattle to matter had just become the only part of the operation still functioning. The fire had not avoided the mesa. It had climbed straight toward it. It burned through waist-high weeds below the road, jumped a drainage, and entered the first grazing cell on the west side. Then it met shorter forage, bare travel lanes, cleared brush, and ground divided into small sections that had been rested, grazed, and watched for 7 years. The flames did not disappear. They lost speed. They lost height. They reached the buildings with less fuel than they had carried across the valley. That difference was not a miracle. It was management, and it began with a question Elena Marquez wrote in the margin of an old cattle ledger long before anyone took her llamas seriously. What job can this land do without pretending it is something else? 7 years earlier, Elena was 49 and newly responsible for a ranch she had never expected to run alone. Arroyo Seco sat outside a small northern New Mexico town where Piñon country opened into high desert grassland. Her family had raised cattle there since her grandfather bought the first parcel after the Korean War. The ranch was not large by Western standards, but it was large enough to consume every daylight hour, and small enough that one bad season could rearrange a family's future. Most of the property was rolling grama grass, dry arroyos, scattered juniper, and low country that could support cattle when the summer monsoon arrived on time. The mesa was different. It rose along the northeast boundary in a dark shelf of basalt and caliche. The soil was shallow. Wind scraped it in winter. Summer rain struck hard and ran off fast. Cows crossed it, nosed through the sparse grass, and drifted back toward the lower pastures before noon. Elena's father called it La Mesa Muerta, the dead mesa. He had tried to improve it the way cattlemen improved bad cattle ground. He pulled a disc over the softer sections. He spread seed before 2 spring storms. He hauled salt and protein tubs uphill, hoping the herd would stay long enough to use what forage existed. The seed came up in patches and disappeared. The cows ate around the rough plants. The tubs attracted them for a few days. Then the animals walked back down and left a web of hoof-broken trails behind them. One summer, Elena's father paid to deepen an old earthen tank near the eastern rim. A thunderstorm filled it to the color of coffee. 3 weeks later, the water had vanished through cracks in the bottom. After that, he stopped trying. The mesa became a place the family paid taxes on and apologized for. But Elena had noticed something that did not fit the word dead. After heavy rain, the lower corrals became mud. Water gathered around tanks. Cattle churned the soil into deep holes that stayed slick for days. The mesa did not. The basalt held firm. The wind dried the surface quickly. There were no boggy corners, almost no standing water, and fewer flies. The same features that made the ground poor for cattle made it stable under lighter pressure. At first, that observation meant nothing. Elena had more urgent problems. Her father died after a short illness. Hay prices rose. A dry winter left the spring grass thin. The cattle market turned against small producers just as she inherited the note on a used tractor, a roof that needed replacement, and a herd built for rainfall patterns that no longer felt reliable. Her father had believed a ranch survived by enduring. Elena believed endurance without measurement was just a slower way to fail. So she began recording everything, not estimates, numbers. She weighed hay deliveries instead of counting bales. She logged mineral use. She marked calving losses, veterinary bills, diesel, fence repairs, grazing days, and the hours spent hauling water when a trough line failed. She photographed each pasture from fixed posts. She recorded rain from a gauge beside the kitchen door. And on the back page of her father's ledger, she made 2 columns. One was labeled, "What this ranch asks from us." The other was labeled, "What each acre gives back." The mesa looked terrible in the second column. It contributed almost nothing to cattle income, but it also revealed a different kind of value. It stayed accessible after storms. It resisted trampling. It offered dry footing, wide visibility, and constant air movement. Elena did not need the mesa to become better cattle ground. She needed to find an agricultural use that matched what it already was. She considered goats first. A neighbor kept Spanish goats on rough country, and the animals used brush cattle, ignored. Elena visited twice, watched one doe climb through a fence opening that looked too small for a rabbit, and crossed goats off the list. She looked at hair sheep. They made sense on paper, but coyotes worked the arroyos around Arroyo Seco every night. A guard dog could help, but Elena was already trying to reduce labor, not add another system she did not understand. The idea that stayed with her came from a fiber festival in Taos. She had gone to price wool blankets for the ranch house. Near the back of the grounds, a man in a dust-covered hat stood beside 3-pack llamas and a table covered with fiber, rope, felted insoles, and photographs from guided trail trips. Elena almost walked past. To her, llamas were parade animals. They belonged in tourist pictures, Christmas pageants, and novelty farms where people paid $5 to take a selfie. Then she heard the owner answer a question about pasture. He did not talk about cuteness. He talked about forage height, parasite cycles, foot structure, heat stress, predator awareness, and the difference between animals that merely survive dry country and animals that can be managed without destroying it. He explained that llamas moved on padded feet rather than hard hooves. They browsed and grazed. They used common dung piles. They handled elevation and cold. Their fiber could be sold, but only if it was clean, sorted, and matched to a real buyer. He also warned the crowd that a llama was not a business plan. If the land, labor, and customer do not connect, he said, all you bought is an expensive mouth. Elena stayed until the crowd left. Then she asked him about water. She asked about fencing. She asked how much hay an adult animal required in a dry winter. She asked what people did with coarse fiber. She asked how many guided trips it took to pay for liability insurance. The man gave her no easy answer. That was why she trusted him. For the next 10 months, Elena treated llamas as a research problem. She visited 4 operations in New Mexico and southern Colorado. She learned to handle animals in a catch pen. She watched shearing. She called a fiber mill. She talked to an insurance agent about public tours. She followed a veterinarian through a herd health day and wrote down every question she had been too embarrassed to ask earlier. She learned that llamas were not cheap cattle. They had different nutrition problems, different handling problems, and different markets. Fiber varied widely. Some animals produced soft, usable fleece. Others produced coarse hair better suited for rope, rugs, or garden felt. Pack animals required training. Breeding required records. Tours required toilets, signs, parking, and people skills. The more she learned, the less magical the idea became, and the more useful it looked. In the spring of her second year alone, Elena sold 14 cows before the grass declined any further. She used part of the money to repair the ranch's main well. With the rest, she bought 8 female llamas, 1 gelded pack animal, and enough woven wire fencing to divide the mesa into 5 grazing cells. The central lane ran from the water tank to a low metal-sided barn set behind a basalt rise. It was not pretty, it was practical. The joke started before the animals arrived. The new fence could be seen from the county road. So could the long-necked silhouettes on the ridge. At Ortega Feed and Supply, someone asked Elena whether she planned to open a circus. Another rancher said the animals looked like camels assembled from leftover parts. The sharpest comments came from Wade Harrell, a cattle buyer who had spent 30 years telling families what their calves were worth. Wade was not foolish. He understood cattle, weather, debt, and the speed at which a rural business could collapse. He had also watched alpaca bubbles, exotic bird schemes, and direct market promises arrive with bright brochures and leave behind auction notices. When he heard Elena had sold cows to buy llamas, he stared at her across the feed store counter. "You traded beef for decorations," he said. Elena told him the animals were working stock. Wade looked toward the men by the coffee pot. "Then I guess the decorations have jobs." The room laughed. Elena bought salt, loaded it herself, and drove home. She did not need Wade to believe her. She needed the mesa to answer. The first year gave her no clean victory. One llama developed a chronic skin problem under its fiber. Another refused to enter the handling chute unless Elena walked backward in front of it with a coffee can of pellets. A young female slipped through a gate that had been hung 6 inches too high and spent half a day pacing the outside of the fence, frantic to rejoin the herd she had just escaped. Then came shearing. Elena had built a temporary work area from cattle panels and confidence. By noon, one panel was bent, the shearing table had shifted, and Elena had discovered that confidence was not a structural material. The fiber was worse. She had imagined neat bags of valuable fleece. What she had were sacks containing good fiber, coarse fiber, dust, hay, and enough vegetable matter to suggest the llamas had been sleeping in a seed catalog. A mill rejected 2 bags. A craft buyer offered so little for another that shipping would have cost more than the sale. At the end of the season, Elena had sold less than 1/3 of the usable fiber. The numbers in her ledger were blunt. The llama enterprise had lost money. Wade heard about it. "Those decorations working overtime?" he asked. Elena said, "They are teaching me. That is an expensive school." He was right. But the mesa was changing. Not dramatically. Not beautifully. The difference showed up in measurements before it showed up in photographs. The llamas used the sparse grass without pounding the soil into trails. Their padded feet left the surface mostly intact. Elena moved them before the plants were grazed to the crown. The common dung areas kept waste concentrated, which made cleanup easier and reduced the scattered bare spots cattle had created around preferred loafing areas. She rested each cell long enough for the grama and dropseed to recover. Where brush thickened near the barn, she cut it. Where weeds grew tall along the lane, she mowed or grazed them early. She kept a 30-foot working zone around the water system because hoses, valves, and trailers needed access. None of it was designed as wildfire defense. It was designed to make daily work possible. By late summer, the mesa still looked harsh, but it looked organized. The grass was more even. The bare scars were smaller. The central lane stayed open. The animals used ground the cattle had treated as a hallway. Elena took forage readings before every move. She logged hay use. She compared the cost of supporting the llama herd with the 14 cows she had sold. The savings were real, but not spectacular. That mattered. Spectacular numbers made good sales pitches. Ordinary numbers made better decisions. In the second year, Elena stopped trying to sell fiber as a raw commodity. She joined a regional fiber pool that graded fleece by use, combined small lots, and sent them to a mill in volume. The finest fiber became yarn. The medium grades became socks, boot inserts, and woven throws. The coarse material became garden mats that suppressed weeds and slowly broke down in soil. Then Elena found the second income stream. The gelding she had bought as an afterthought was calm, strong, and easy to lead. She trained 2 more animals to carry light packs. A guide from Santa Fe asked whether he could rent them for a short high-country trip. Elena said no. Then she asked what he would pay. By the next spring, she offered 4 guided llama walks on the mesa. She hated the phrase, llama walk. It sounded exactly like the novelty business Wade believed she had started. But the visitors did not come only to pet animals. They came to learn how a dry land ranch worked. They paid to walk the basalt shelf, see the grazing cells, handle fiber, and hear why one piece of land demanded a different animal. Teachers brought students. A veterans group booked a quiet morning hike. A family from Albuquerque returned 3 times and bought nearly every pair of socks Elena had in stock. The animals produced fiber. They also gave people a reason to come through the gate. By the end of year 2, the llama side had covered feed, veterinary care, processing, and insurance. It had not paid Elena a full salary. It had stopped losing money. Wade called that breaking even with extra steps. Elena wrote it in the ledger. Then she kept going. Year 3 brought better rain. Year 4 brought almost none. The snowpack was thin. Spring winds arrived early. By May, the lower pastures had the color of old rope. Hay dealers raised prices before the first cutting. Ranchers faced the usual 3 choices: buy feed, sell animals, or wait for weather to rescue a decision already going bad. Elena sold early. She reduced the cattle herd by another 11 head while prices were still reasonable. She also refused to increase the llama herd, even though the guided walks were booked and the fiber cooperative wanted more product. She had 32 llamas by then. Her records suggested the mesa could support more in a wet year. They also showed what happened when recovery slowed. Adding 10 animals might have increased revenue. It also might have consumed the plants that held the system together. Restraint leaves almost no evidence. There is no dramatic photograph of the herd you chose not to buy. No invoice for the hay you never had to order. No applause for a pasture that was not ruined. Elena left money on the table because the ground was more valuable than one strong season. That decision became important 3 years later. The monsoon failed again. By late August, the county had gone 46 days without measurable rain. Cheatgrass along road edges had cured to pale straw. Juniper branches snapped dry. Welding, mowing, chains, and overheated bearings were treated as ignition risks. The fire started after a dry thunderstorm struck the Sangre de Cristo foothills. For the first day, it stayed small. On the second, wind pushed it through timber. On the third, it crossed into grassland and began moving east. At 4:20 in the afternoon, Elena received an evacuation warning. She canceled a tour, filled every water container on the mesa, and moved the llamas into the 2 cells nearest the barn. Those cells had been grazed 6 weeks earlier and had not fully regrown. The central lane was nearly bare from years of movement. The work zone around the barn had been cleared in June. A strip below the western fence had been mowed because tumbleweeds collected there. Again, none of those choices could stop a wind-driven fire. But together, they changed what the fire would find near the buildings. Elena loaded veterinary supplies, registration papers, family documents, and finished inventory into a stock trailer. She opened the lower cattle pasture into a broad holding field that had shorter grass and fewer trees. She connected 2 hoses to the tank, knowing nobody might be there to use them. At 9:47 that night, a sheriff's deputy drove into the yard and told her the fire had jumped the ridge. The evacuation was no longer optional. Elena looked toward the mesa. The llamas were pressed together near the barn, ears pointed west. Above them, the sky pulsed orange. She wanted to stay. Every rancher wants to believe one more gate, one more hose, one more pass with a tractor can turn disaster into work. But fire under wind is not work. It is force. Elena climbed into the truck and left. She spent the night in a middle school gym with 60 other people and a line of dogs tied to folded bleachers. Nobody slept. Phones lit faces until the signal failed. Rumors moved faster than official reports. A house was gone. No, 3 houses. The highway had closed. The highway had reopened. A volunteer crew had saved the church. The fire had crossed the river. The fire had not crossed the river. At 2:13 in the morning, someone showed Elena a video taken from the county road. The image shook. Flame moved across the lower pasture in a bright horizontal line. For 3 seconds, the camera lifted toward the mesa. The barn was visible as a black shape against orange sky. Then the video ended. Elena watched those 3 seconds until the phone battery died. At dawn, the wind weakened. Crews held the road. By late morning, the evacuation order dropped to a warning. Elena returned behind a sheriff's vehicle. The first thing she smelled was wet ash. The second was burned hay. The lower corrals were ruined. Wire sagged from charred posts. The old hay shed had collapsed into a rectangle of twisted roofing. One corner of the machine shop had blistered and peeled. She drove past slowly. Then the road climbed. The western fence on the mesa was black for nearly 400 feet. A line of burned grass crossed the first cell and entered the second. Several junipers outside the managed area had torched from bottom to crown. But near the central lane, the burn pattern changed. Flame marks grew shorter. Blackened patches broke into islands. The fire had consumed taller fuel, then reached ground where less material was available to carry it. The barn stood behind the basalt rise. The steel siding was smoke-streaked. One plastic gutter had melted. The sorting room door was warped. But the buildings were there, so were the llamas, all 38. They stood around the water tank, coated in ash, chewing as if survival were another slow ranch chore. Elena sat in the truck and cried before she opened the door. Fire crews later told her the mesa had not been safe. Embers had landed everywhere. Flames had entered the grazing cells. A stronger wind, a different angle, or one burning juniper falling against the barn could have changed the outcome. But the shorter vegetation, broken fuel pattern, maintained lane, and cleared working zone had reduced flame length near the structures. The system did not defeat the fire. It reduced the number of things the fire could use. 3 days later, Wade Harold drove up with fence stretchers, clips, and 2 rolls of wire. Elena was pulling burned staples from a corner post when he arrived. Wade walked the mesa without saying much. He examined the black line at the western boundary. He looked at the short grass near the lane. He kicked ash away from a basalt rock and studied the unburned stems behind it. Finally, he looked toward the llamas. "You were lucky," he said. Elena nodded. Very. Wade had expected resistance. His shoulders shifted, almost disappointed. Then Elena added, "I just tried not to make luck carry the whole ranch." She took him into the sorting room. Ash had entered around the door, but the metal cabinet was intact. Inside were 7 years of grazing charts, animal counts, forage readings, income records, and photographs taken from the same marked posts. Elena showed him the mesa before fencing. He saw scattered brush, cattle trails, and tall weeds around unused corners. She showed him the most recent summer. The ground was not lush. It was shorter, more uniform, and divided by access lanes. She showed him when each cell had been grazed. She showed him the June brush clearing log. She showed him why the 2 cells nearest the barn carried less fuel in August. Wade asked how much the entire llama system had cost. Elena told him. He asked what fiber brought in. She told him that too. Then she explained what the ledger actually showed. Fiber alone did not justify the enterprise. Neither did tours, neither did pack rentals, breeding stock, composted manure, or seasonal product boxes. Each stream was small. Together they paid for the animals, contributed to ranch overhead, and reduced the amount of income that depended on cattle prices and rainfall. The mesa did not produce one impressive check. It produced several modest checks from different people for different reasons. Wade turned a page showing 5 years of totals. So the llamas saved the ranch, he said. Elena closed the ledger. No. She pointed through the open door toward the blackened slope. They gave one bad piece of land a useful job. That gave the ranch another way to breathe. Wade nodded once. I still do not want one. Elena smiled. I am still not selling you one. That was when the joke ended. Not because Wade became a llama believer. He did not. He still preferred cattle. He still warned people that specialty livestock attracted dreamers faster than it created customers. Elena agreed with him. What changed was his definition of serious work. He stopped calling the mesa a petting farm. In the years after the fire, Arroyo Seco became steadier, but it did not become large. Elena resisted expansion. She did not double the llama herd after a magazine ran a story about the fire. She did not advertise the animals as wildfire protection. She did not claim every dry ranch needed camelids. Instead, she kept measuring. In a wet year, the mesa grew more forage than the herd could use. Elena mowed fire-prone strips and rested one cell for seed. In a dry year, she reduced guided trips, fed hay early, and left 2 cells untouched. When fiber sales slowed, she cut processing volume instead of pretending inventory was income. Her son Mateo returned from Phoenix after working in logistics for 9 years. He did not romanticize ranch life. He built a shipping system, negotiated better rates, and reorganized the product line around items customers reordered, rather than items that merely looked good at a craft fair. The fiber cooperative expanded to 6 producers. The group had enough volume to secure better milling terms. Mateo added guided sunrise walks during the coolest months and stopped offering them during peak fire season. The ranch's income became less elegant and more durable. Cattle still mattered. So did hay, so did rain. But one market no longer controlled every decision. A weak cattle year could be softened by direct sales. A slow tourism season could be softened by wholesale fiber orders. A drought could be answered with lower breeding, fewer animals, and more rest. The system did not remove risk. It separated risk into pieces small enough to manage. 9 years after the fire, a young rancher named Lucas Baca came to Arroyo Seco with a question. He had inherited a place west of Wagon Mound. Most of it was decent cow country, but 80 acres along the rim were rocky, windy, and difficult to water. He had seen photographs of Elena's llamas on the mesa. How many should I start with, he asked. Elena did not answer. She asked how long water remained in his rim tank after July rain. Lucas did not know. She asked which plants stayed green into August. He named 2 and guessed at the rest. She asked where snow drifted, whether a trailer could reach the pasture in winter, how close the nearest fiber mill was, and whether anyone in his household wanted to handle visitors. Lucas became quieter with each question. I thought you were going to tell me how to do what you did, he said. Elena pulled a clean ledger from a shelf. I am. She handed it to him. Do not start with the animal. Start with the ground. Lucas spent a year recording water, forage, access, labor, predators, and costs. In the end, he did not buy llamas. He fenced a smaller area for hair sheep, hired a herder during lambing, and sold grazing service to a utility company that needed vegetation reduced below transmission lines. The system fit his land better. Elena considered that proof he had understood the lesson. Arroyo Seco was never a story about llamas being superior to cattle. It was never a story about worthless land hiding easy money, and it was never a story about animals stopping wildfire. The mesa survived because years of ordinary decisions changed the conditions around the buildings. Smaller grazing cells, conservative stocking, shorter fuel near the barn, maintained lanes, cleared brush, reliable water, accurate records. several income streams instead of one. None of those decisions looked heroic when Elena made them. Most looked small, some looked cautious, a few looked ridiculous from the county road. But land is not useless because it fails at the first job people give it. For decades, the Marquez family asked the mesa one question: how many cows can it carry? The answer was almost none. So they stopped listening. Elena asked a better question: what can this ground do well? It stayed firm after rain. It drained quickly. It tolerated light-footed animals. It sat high above the flood-prone bottom. It could be divided, watched, and rested. Its weakness as cattle country was not the end of its value. It was information. The hay shed was rebuilt. The lower corrals were replaced with steel posts. New grass returned slowly to the blackened slopes. For years, a dark scar remained on the western basalt where heat had passed over the mesa. The llama barn stayed in the same place. So did the central lane. On dry evenings, the herd gathered beside the water tank while wind moved across the ridge. Drivers on the county road still slowed to look at them. Some laughed. Elena never minded. From the highway, the animals still looked strange. From inside the gate, every fence, lane, and grazing cell had a reason. The mesa never became good cattle country. It became something more valuable. Ground that still had a job when the rest of the ranch ran out of options.